Thanks for joining us, everybody. One for a Fridays with a Forester. Today, our topic is wildlife on your property. And our speaker today is John Loegering from University of Minnesota Crookston. And he's on our extension staff up there and a wildlife specialist. And he can talk more about himself later, certainly. But yeah, we're glad to have him. So this particular Zoom presentation, you'll be open to chat instead of questions and answers, Q&A, usually on some of these Zoom meetings, but we'll open the chat up and you can put your questions in chat. We'll want you to keep muted and not be on your video. And then actually we're recording these webinars, Fridays with a Forester, at z.umn.edu/Fridays. So if you miss one of these presentations, you certainly go back and watch it. John, I'll let you share your screen and I'll stop and we'll get going.
Okay, I think I've now shared my screen. You good to see it?
Very good. Thank you.
Well, fantastic. Thanks, Gary, very much. Again, as Gary mentioned, I'm John Loegering. I'm an extension wildlife specialist. I live up here in Crookston, but I do wildlife sorts of things with extension statewide. And I'm a wildlife ecologist. So I know it's Fridays with a Forester, but I appreciate you giving me the floor and asking me to talk about a few things here related to wildlife. The topic today is going to be essentially techniques to survey wildlife on your woodland. And admittedly, there are lots of reasons to do so, and certainly it's a topic that I get questions about. People are curious. Maybe you are interested in surveying for various wildlife species that are important for management. There are certainly lots of critters that people are interested in. Everything from the big ones like deer and wolves and coyotes and such, down to even some of those small, medium-sized predators, or even rodents, and that might be you might have vole damage that you're interested in characterizing. So I'll just say that from a wildlife perspective, establishing presence or absence is fairly straightforward and fairly easy. Establishing measures of abundance for the average woodland owner is a lot more difficult. And of course, part of the reason why it's difficult is that abundance varies seasonally and annually. Certainly some birds are here in the summer, gone in the wintertime, or and you may have critters that only infrequently frequent your landscape. So really, in my mind, the best thing you can do is grab that notebook and start taking a few notes. Careful records taken over the course of many years, many seasons, really are the best way to track wildlife abundance or even wildlife presence absence over the course of time in your woodland. Is the best way to document it, versus the sort of the coffee shop a grade of info, where y'all are sitting around having coffee or a donut with your buddies, and you start recalling, yeah, I remember back 2 decades ago and I used to see blankety blank. Well, it doesn't really matter. It's hard to quantify the abundance when you're doing that sort of thing. Human memory is really fickle and incomplete. So I'm sure that some of the foresters have often talked about how your woodlands change very slowly with time, and unless you're keeping a written record that you can go back and refer to some hard observations, it's tough to really characterize those. So anecdotal information is fine. It's just less useful. So if you want to have the most useful data, start taking notes. I know it's a little archaic. And for some of you, it might be a little too archaic. Maybe you've entered the digital age, you're a digital native. In that case, there are some apps out there that you can start to use that will help to characterize or at least document presence absence in your woodland. And that's something like iNaturalist. And we could probably do a whole Friday with a forester on iNaturalist. But it's a great example of an electronic tool that helps you characterize things. And if you take a photo of a plant or an insect or a mammal track, that you're not really quite sure on, there is a broad range of professionals throughout the nation that will be more than happy to help you identify it. So I have used this in class many a times to just to demonstrate, you know, I snap a photo of a leaf, post it to iNaturalist, and you know, by the end of my class period, I've gotten several professional experts that have said, nope, you know, this is you know, that's hackberry, or that's whatever, you know, it's very, very good. So, and you can set up a project. It's called a project. You just draw a polygon around your property, and then you've got your own personal BioBlitz. Everything you record within that geographic location is logged in the same project, and then you can go back and look at that over the years. In terms of techniques to characterize or to quantify wildlife on your property, right? Direct observation is the easiest method. It's the most direct method, and all you really need is some time, binoculars, and maybe some field guides, and that's all you need, right? You go out there and take some notes, try to standardize as much as you can. And by standardization, I mean, you know, if you're going to do some surveys, or you're going to try to, you know, I really want to know what's in my woodland, and I want to be able to compare from last year to this year to next year to 20 years from now. And maybe you hadn't thought about that, but is that important to you? If it is, then one of the techniques is to, you know, get your notebook and then just standardize by time or distance. You know, you might take a 2-hour walk on one Saturday a month and record what you see. And that's a great example of how you can use that to track things seasonally as well as over time. And as long as you standardize it, or maybe you just take a half-mile walk, right? You can standardize it by distance as well. You know, really that gives you what you really need. You know, obviously observing an animal is sort of the gold standard of establishing its presence on your property, but but animals also might leave evidence of their existence or their presence. So one thing that we often use is signs, you know, indicating presence. And, you know, sometimes it's scat, sometimes it's tracks. And again, if you take notes and trust them rather than your memory, and standardize them in some way, you can compare them between years and what have you. So here are a couple of examples of the various methods or mechanisms that you can use to document wildlife on your property. You can see over on the right-hand side of that screen here, I've kind of got, and I'll show you these for various techniques that I'm going to talk about. The sort of group that they target, the technical skill needed, the cost, and the season. And so when it comes to, you know, determining wildlife in your property, sometimes we use sign. You know, and if you're interested in tree squirrels, well, you can certainly count their nests during the leaf-free season. You can do browse or bite surveys. You know, one thing that you know, you might go out and examine 10 shrubs that are all under 10 feet tall and look for evidence of deer or rabbit nibbling. And if you quantify it, then it gives you a way to compare and see if it's going up or down relative to different years or different seasons. But there are all sorts of other techniques that we use to inventory various wildlife, and even we could use in inventory tent caterpillars or various damage aspects or wasp nests or what have you. Anything that's visible, right? You can quantify in a way of just taking a standard distance or search time and recording what you see. Right. So anything that indicates presence, and again, careful notes is handy. So where do I tend to see that? Well, in wildlife terms, we often do this with things like squirrel nests or muskrat houses. Again, that bite survey is something that we go out and take a look at the nibbles that we see from various wildlife species, and as a quick, helpful hint to identify them. Remember that deer often leave these ragged tips to branches that they might nibble off. The reason they do that, of course, is because they don't have upper incisors. They only have lower incisors. So when they go to bite, you know, they sort of clamp that twig with their lower teeth and that hard cornified upper part of their mouth, and then tear it off, and that leaves a jagged edge, as opposed to rabbits and rodents and such, which will have that nice clipped off end. But you also might look at evidence of deer browse, right? Heavily browsed twigs tend to have this sort of stunted or very bushy appearance, as opposed to lightly or unbrowsed tend to have a much wider appeal. And you might also be looking for evidence of damage, which may be in the springtime. You're looking for evidence of rodent or rabbit gnawing on the bark of fruit trees or recently planted trees in your forest stand. And while a forester might not appreciate this, right, you might also look for evidence of something like pileated woodpeckers or other woodpeckers. All would give you an index of various wildlife species that are on your property. Another thing you might take a look at is scat. Obviously, the larger the animal, the better it is to use this. Everything leaves a little evidence of their presence in your property. Most scat is actually identifiable to species. You can also do content analysis if you really want to, as they say, dig into it. But we'd want to, of course, remind you that appropriate personal protective equipment would be needed. You don't want to be just digging into scat without protecting yourself from potential diseases and parasites and that sort of thing. In general, those diseases and parasites are more important when you're talking about carnivores as opposed to herbivores. But nonetheless, I'd say protect yourself. The trouble is, of course, scat is great for confirming presence or absence of a critter using your property, but it's hard to do animal abundance because the number of pellet groups that are left by deer varies by season because their diet changes. You can even buy plastic models that will, that you can use to practice your scat identification. And that way, when you get out into the field, while you're stuck looking at these, and some of these are repeats, but many of them are all unique. The first thing that you do is probably want to grab a field guide of some sort. And there are all sorts of field guides available. And I've got probably 10 here on my desk. You might also try tracks. Again, it's the same thing. Learning tracks is not that hard. I'll bet there are people on this webinar that are really good at driving down the interstate at 65 miles an hour and being able to pick out a make and model of cars as they fly by in the approaching lane. Well, if you can do that, you can certainly learn the tracks of animals. You just have to spend the same amount of time learning some of them. A good field guide, oops, I got my blur on here. So a good field guide is often helpful. This is a nice little one. You can get a big one, right? They are all pretty simple to use. You can also learn the animal's behavior if you happen to see the critter. But there are, as I said, field guides and internet sources available that will help step you through how to identify tracks. Most people, when they start this, they are a bit overwhelmed, and yet by 10 minutes in, it's actually pretty straightforward. You might also, there are also classes available at environmental learning centers that will train you, if you will. A lot of folks do them in wintertime, right? Where you walk a known distance and record all the tracks that you happen to intercept while you're walking that established distance. Obviously, fresh snow makes it easier, so you want to standardize with the number of days since the last snow. And here are a couple of examples, right? And I'm going to guess that a lot of you, when you look at that upper picture, you probably are going to identify that, especially when you look at the ruler here, and that's a foot. Okay, so that's a really big animal. That's of course, a black bear track there. The bottom one's a little harder. It's a little smaller depending upon the size of the screen that you're watching this on, but I'll have you quickly take a quick look at how round these various tracks are. And I'll even give you the hint of there's no evidence of a toenail in these tracks. So really nice and round tracks without a toenail usually indicates a cat. And these actually are Canada lynx tracks. And then this one is one that most of us have already seen. because you've seen your either your pet or your neighbor's pet, right? These are clearly a dog track, and if we do some measurements, we can tell that they're wolf tracks. So one thing that folks will often do in the wintertime, it's a great winter time activity, is look for tracks. Now I will tell you that if you find one that you don't know, try to take a good photo. And the one thing that you can do to help anybody trying to help you identify it is lay a ruler, carry a small ruler and lay a ruler next to that track so we get real accurate measurements, because that's probably the hardest thing, is to get size down. You might do it in the summer as well. Sometimes we do track surveys in the summer as part of wildlife surveys, right? Where we take essentially a hula hoop sized area, put some fine sand, sift it there. Actually, there's a standardized survey that they do where they do this every half mile along a roadway. It requires a little more equipment, right? Shovels and rakes and hula hoops, and then you can buy these really stinky tabs that are essentially plaster impregnated with a fatty acid that is exceptionally potent. You do not want to. The reason there's an exclamation point after gloves is because you need to handle these with latex gloves, or you will your family will not allow you back into the home. But you could also use tuna, sardines, cat food, really anything that has an aroma, and then take careful notes about where you put it and the bait you use and the time of year and that sort of thing. And you get all sorts of tracks. And here's a good example of a class I had establishing that tracking station on the side of a road. But you could certainly do it along trails in your property and get a sense of what's walking by. Tend to sample the predators, the small and medium sized predators. One other low impact thing, if you're interested in sampling reptiles and amphibians, would be cover boards. And you just take a 2x2 sheet of plywood, toss it on the ground. More of them is better than fewer of them. But if you're just kind of curious, I'd encourage everyone to throw 2 or 3 out there and see what you get. Once a month, walk over, lift it up, take a look underneath, try to catch it if you can. You got to be quick. And it's a good way of sampling what might be using, small mammals as well as reptiles and amphibians. Certainly snakes. Now, I will say that snakes and wasps that tend to live under these cover boards tend to startle people. So just be mindful of that. We did a project at Sherburne where we put out cover boards, and you can see, we got a whole bunch of cover boards and hauled them all over the place and sent them out there and then went back and checked them. I'm not going to really talk much about live trapping. I mean, you could do it. We generally don't encourage it because you catch small to medium-sized mammals, and they're easy to identify, but it's pretty equipment intensive, and you need some technical skill and probably some permits. Plus, catching things sounds like fun right up until you get an animal in a trap, and then you have to deal with them. And if you happen to catch a carnivore or a rodent, right, they both have teeth that are designed to open up pretty well. Carnivores have teeth that rip and tear flesh, and rodents open up walnuts, and your body's a lot softer than that. So I generally discourage live trapping unless you have some technical skill. Plus, realize that you set these traps out and you think, oh, I'm going to sample some things, and the first thing you're going to catch, well, okay, maybe not the first thing, but everyone who sets out a medium-sized trap eventually catches a skunk, and no one wants to deal with a skunk when they come up to their trap. So be mindful that when you set out a trap that's the size that a skunk will catch, you might be thinking you're going to catch a woodchuck, but dollars to donuts are that you're gonna catch a skunk and end up trying to deal with that. And I guess if we get questions about that, I can tell you how, but it's unpleasant. A better sort of survey to do if you're interested in things like herps, reptiles and amphibians, would be use your ears. And Minnesota has a frog and toad calling survey that they do across the state. But they have a protocol that's pretty set up. They've got example calls that you can download and listen to. And so it's pretty easy to do. Each frog or toad species makes different, sounds. So as you stand in your woodland and listen on those, especially those spring mornings or spring evenings, you can listen to them and record what you got going on, what different species you have. You could make it formal if you want, or you could just do it for fun. But I would encourage you to go to the Minnesota, I'll have some links here in a bit, but go to the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources site, look for the frog and toad calling survey, and they'll have all the resources you need to do it right there on your property. So again, a little bit more technical skill, but very little cost. Now, some folks, they really want to know what's out there. And one of the hardest groups to sample, of course, are bats, because bats are quiet. You see them only at night. They are not something that's easy to detect. But today we've got some pretty interesting technology that can help us for a relatively inexpensive. Well, the cost varies, of course, but for relatively inexpensive, you can get a bat detector, an active bat detector for your phone. Mine, I should have turned off my blur here, but mine, I got this little device here that simply plugs into the bottom of my iPhone, and I can stand in the forest and detect bats, and it'll automatically identify them for you. It's a fantastic little deal. I think these are about $200. If you start to really love that, you can upgrade and get more expensive devices that are battery powered, and just stick them in, tie them to a tree in the forest, and it will record bats as they fly throughout your property. And then you have to do some analysis and that sort of thing. So you can make this as big or a little of a project as you'd like, right? The active bat detectors are pretty simple, and they do the ID for you. If you do the passive recorder, so it records it to a flash drive or to a little SD card, then that gets a little more complicated and technical to do the analysis. But they sell them that they plug into iPads and iPhones and Android phones and that sort of thing. So that's kind of a fun way to figure out what the bat community is like on your property. And lastly, of course, this is a technique that's used by many, and we can, I know that Gary has got some experience doing this as well. Camera traps are pretty popular. You can find them under all sorts of different monikers, trail cameras, game cameras, etc. You tend to target larger creatures, but to be honest, as the sophistication of these trail cams have improved over the years, some folks are even using them to sample small rodents at night. Right, lots of different models. Still in video recording, I really do like to have some video capacity. Some work during only the daytime, some work at both. So if you're interested in sampling medium to large critters, at least seeing what's out there, a trail cam might be the thing to do. Think about where you want to put it. Right. If you have a place that a lot of people tend to be walking by, I would encourage you to put it up high and sort of aim it down. Right. You put it 10 feet high, it keeps it sort of out of the normal human eye range, as opposed to if you put it 2 feet off the ground, why, then you're going to catch all the skunks and the raccoons and the woodchucks and the weasels and all that sort of thing. In some cases, you'll want to armor that camera, protect it in some way with an enclosure. Certainly, if you have a lot of critters like bears, people, or raccoons, that will certainly be something that you'll want to think about. Sometimes folks will put bait out in the camera's view so that they'll try to attract maybe medium-sized predators. So if you do that, I would strongly encourage you to be mindful that you should never handle bait and handle the camera, because then the camera smells like the bait, and you might get a black bear trying to gnaw on it or something. Best to place them on trails or travel corridors, that sort of thing. It's ideal if you can get broadside photos, and sometimes you can't control that. And I always encourage folks, bring a yardstick or two, because it's often nice to have some sort of scale. Oh yeah, there we go, baits. Oh, some folks, if you're a deer hunter, the gut pile that you create after harvesting a deer is a great place to set up a trail camera. I'd also encourage you to Google Offal Project, because that's a project done by a person here at the University of Minnesota who's looking at use of gut piles after the deer harvest season. Lots of things that you can, we can have a discussion maybe a bit later as to what the features are that you want to have. Obviously, the better the lens and the memory would be great. Weather resistant is essential. I personally like an infrared flash because you get great night photos. If you're going to do it here in the wintertime, I encourage you to use lithium batteries rather than the rechargeables, just because of the period of revisiting. Unless you're going to be able to revisit them frequently, the lithium tend to last longer and maintain their charge longer in cold weather. And then, of course, always do a walk test with your dog to make sure that it's working after you place it there. And I already mentioned this, right? Put a yardstick or two out there, something for scale, so we get an idea what the size of the critter are. You'd be surprised at how many photos of coyotes I get that everyone is convinced they saw a wolf in their backyard or in their woodland. And in some cases it certainly is, but in many cases it's simply because of the perspective of the camera. It looks bigger than it actually is. Oh, and trim the vegetation unless you want to get a lot of photos of moving vegetation. I've learned that one the hard way more than once. And when you set it up, try to be mindful of sunshine and snow. Obviously, if you put it up in October and you put it too low, the snow is gonna eventually bury it. And if you put it up facing east, those morning shots are going to be tough because of the sun shining in the lens. I put together a bunch of resources that I'm going to drop here into the chat. All sorts of links that might be helpful, and I'll do that here in just a second. But the sorts of things you need to do wildlife surveys on your landscape, field guides. I really encourage. I got stacks of field guides on my desk. I'd encourage you to go to a state park or a bookstore or someplace or an environmental learning center where you can get a handle on one, because it's important to get one that you feel comfortable with, one that is appropriately detailed for your current interest and level. You don't have to start with the most complex field guide. Start with something simple. If it's something that appeals to you, you can always, go back to the bookstore and find another one, or search on Amazon, or do whatever you do your shopping. There are a lot of resources out there that are fantastic. Just give them a try and see what works for you. And other resources would be, things like iNaturalist, eBird. If you're into birds, start doing it electronically. Use eBird. And then there's some other electronic resources here, as I mentioned in the presentation. So I'll drop those into the chat. And I think I've gone my 25 minutes, and I'll sit back and stop sharing my slides, and we can have a discussion or chat, and I'll address any questions that folks might have.
Yes, we'll open up for questions. And I'll share my screen with John's information here.
I just dropped the electronic resources so that if you'd like to just hit this, if you look at your chat, if you open your chat windows, there are 3 dots on the right down at the bottom half. And if you click on that, it gives you the ability to save your chat. And that way you can save those electronic resources should you want to.
Thanks, John. Very well done. I would like to introduce myself first. I guess I didn't do that before. Gary Wyatt. I'm part of our forestry team and extension. And also we have Matt Russell and Emily Dombeck, and actually Eli Sagor, Jeff Jackson. And I think that's all of our team. Maybe did I miss anybody? Oh, Angie Gupta is also on the webcam here. Any questions? And you can either put them in chat, or we're group that you could actually unmute yourself and ask away if you like. Thanks for those resources. John, you mentioned a lot of good things about the cams, and we did a research study on actually a trail cam study around turkey barns a couple years ago, and we looked at 3 different cams, and by golly, we had a $250 camera and Bushnell and I think Browning, and then the Blaze Video. We tried 3 different cameras, and one night in my backyard, set them all up, and there was I think some were recording maybe 100 shots, 40 shots, and this Blaze Video came up with like 200 shots. So there's really a difference in some of these trail cams, so you may want to check them out. And
yeah, I couldn't agree more, Gary. You got to sort of gauge it, and you can spend anywhere from under $100 to I use some research grade cameras that are, well, frankly, they're pretty fancy, and they're $400, $500, well beyond what any typical landowner would need. But mine can take photos of little voles and that sort of thing. So that's what we use them for. But yeah, you get all sorts of interesting things. We just set some up at our local natural history area, and caught all sorts of interesting photos of fisher and coyotes and foxes. I got a coyote. I got a poor coyote that's clearly suffering from mange and is going to have has had a very tough winter. That's for sure.
Angie asked a question, John. What are the most common mistakes you see folks making when trying to systemically understand wildlife on their property?
I think everyone starts with a general curiosity about, I wonder what I have here. And the challenge is not taking notes. If you don't, if you rely, we all think we have better memories than we do. And as time passes, it tends to compress the early memories. And so not sitting down and recording notes and sort of thinking about what is it that you want to understand about your property, I think is probably the biggest systematic problem is just take more careful notes. Take 10 minutes and jot down what you saw this morning. Buy a binder or what have you. I guess I'm maybe an old schooler. I think something physical that I can sit and write at. I maybe go for a morning walk and then sit down with my cup of coffee and take some physical notes. They certainly can be electronic. They certainly can be with iNaturalist or eBird or what have you, depending upon what you're trying to do. But very often I get folks who have observations, and they almost always report, yeah, I wish I would have started taking a few more notes, 15 years ago, because our environments change, and they change slowly enough so that they are sometimes not perceivable. And so taking those careful notes are probably the biggest thing. Let's see, systematic understand. Yeah, that's probably it. And then just, time on task, being out there in your forest property, just trying to get a handle on what you see. Frankly, that's where something like iNaturalist is. You can download an app to your smartphone, and when you see something that you're curious about, snap a photo, snap several photos, and you'll get some experts to weigh in on it fairly readily, or even some volunteer naturalists. But it'll give you a chance to begin to broaden your understanding. We all aren't experts in everything. So using some of those resources can be quite helpful.
See another question from Troy Salzer. He's our extension educator in, I think, St. Louis County now. What are your thoughts, John, on developing or of establishing tree plots or plots of tree plantings habitat to encourage visits? And I assume that might be for deer or for maybe bear up there. I'm not sure, Troy, but yeah, what are your thoughts on that, John?
Well, yeah, certainly look at what critters like to eat. I could make all the foresters angry. Say, yeah, if you want to get deer, you just plant a bunch of white pine. They love those little white pines. But yeah, you certainly, if you look at what the species requirements are, if you have a plan on what you're interested in fostering or encouraging, then planting various things on your property will increase the likelihood of them visiting. Now realize that some critters can be easily managed on the scope and scale of your property, and some are a little bit less so. Just thinking about the natural home range of critters. If you're trying to increase frequency of observation for black bear, you certainly can do that, but you probably can't provide everything they need unless you have hundreds of acres of property, or probably thousands. The black bear home range is pretty large, but like a deer, it's a square mile. So increasing the frequency of just seeing them, you absolutely can plant things. Like sharp-tailed grouse and rough grouse. Yeah, so rough grouse. So some of the things that folks do for rough grouse is plant, either plant or encourage, right? There are plenty of forest plants that they use that you could simply encourage. Any of those berry producing plants that you see in the fall with berries. Dogwood is of particular interest. Rough grouse management typically is a fragmented landscape. Usually aspen is the sort of the dominant. It's best with a dominant aspen component. Often they'll seed trails with Dutch clover, with clover, so that they have this green food source. Grouse are for the most part vegetarians. In terms of sharp-tailed grouse, that's kind of a different, that's not really a forest talk in the sense that they really like more the brushlands, and the challenge there is keeping the landscape more open. The sharp-tailed grouse are going to look for those open areas for both drumming as well as nesting, and that interplay between essentially an open landscape and a more brushy landscape, but certainly not a forested landscape.
Just to add to that, Troy, I've actually planted some apple trees in my deer hunting areas, and obviously surrounded them with high cattle wire panels, 16 feet long and then 5 feet tall. Hooped, two of them hooped like a football, basically tying two posts together in the middle and then broadening it in the middle, and or at the ends I had two posts, and yeah, that seems to work pretty good. But yeah, the DNR hasn't banned that for baiting yet. I hope not, but yeah, white pine is also a good one for deer too.
a pretty expensive one, I think.
Right.
Yeah, certainly any of those fruit-bearing trees, plums, apples, cherries, there's like Nanking cherries that some folks will plant in shelter belts and such. All are fantastic foods for fruit-eating critters, both birds as well as mammals. The deer will certainly love those apples, Gary. Got to get the trees up over, at least got to get part of the tree up over the escape distance for gnawing on them. Otherwise, you just won't have any. They'll just nibble them off at the at the ground. And the rabbits will be happy too with the barking that they tend to do.
That's right. My son lives near the river bottom, and we just planted a Juneberry, Saskatoon, the serviceberry. Those are all synonymous shrub, and he noticed this winter, right before fall, about 4 does nibbling on that plant almost to the ground. So yeah, you've got to protect some of these plants even in your yard. So yeah, very good.
Yeah, and the key is to find something that makes sense for your landscape. Statewide, Minnesota is maybe 600 miles north to south, corner to corner. Well, probably only about 450, but the different environments that we have means that what works in one area might not work as well in the other area, depending upon growing season and soil conditions and that sort of thing. So, check with your local, your NRCS office will often have recommendations that are locally specific. So, check with those folks, because they can help you with planting lists, or even your local greenhouse, what have you, your nursery, if they're used to doing wild plantings. If you're interested in planting something, I'd always encourage you to look at what you have in the woods. use the natural stuff first and worry about planting stuff second. But that's sometimes that can be a really labor intensive.
Yep. Thanks, John, for recommending the soil water conservation districts, usually one in every county. And actually some of the soil water conservation districts offer a tree planting and tree sales program. So you may want to check with your county to see if they have a tree program that they actually sell trees, and then trees and shrubs. And then also they can actually plant them for you if you like. A lot of these SWCDs have tree planters. Jeff asked, how have you personally seen shifts in wildlife populations due to warming of climate?
Well, personally, I don't know that I've seen many shifts, but I will rely on my other colleagues and such, right? We certainly have seen distributions be shifting slowly northward. I work mostly on birds, and so birds have the ability to shift pretty readily because they're flying and they're migratory, et cetera. But we see in Crookston, I know folks in the bottom half, the southern half of Minnesota, think cardinals must live everywhere because they are everywhere. But I live 75 miles from Canada. Cardinals have never been distributed here, but they're slowly creeping in. So we see critters like cardinals moving north. We see some of the bird species that are typically limited by snow or cold moving north, like ringneck pheasants. We don't tend to have many of them up this far north, but they're gaining footholds in some of our grasslands. Critters like possums, that are strongly limited by climate. I know that the southern half of the state has a fairly regular possum occurrence. They don't survive up in the northern, both the northeast and northwest part of the state because of cold. They're not really designed to handle really cold temperatures. Their ears freeze off. They get frostbite. The ears get all ratty and their tail gets all ratty because it's a pretty fleshy structures. So they don't tend to survive. But with climate change, we're getting reports, compared to the historic records that we have, those animals are all sort of slowly marching northward. So we do see some of that. Most of the critters I work with are pretty adaptable and have been able to adapt as the climate changes, the vegetation changes, and they're responding to that.
I've seen a lot of raccoons active this time of year, actually almost throughout the winter season. And it seems like I thought they always go into dormancy, but or hibernation. And it seems like I've seen them on the loose in the wintertime here more than ever, which is very interesting here. I live in southwestern Minnesota between Worthington and Mankato, St. James.
Yeah, I think they respond to local temperatures. So what you're seeing is probably that what we know with climate change is it's the evening or the nighttime temperatures that are the tend to be where the biggest warming is occurring, and turns out that's when most wildlife, like you said, they bunker up, they hole up, they try to stay protected. And raccoons don't hibernate. They just really slow down and sort of try to find those refugia, the security areas, and make out the winter that way.
Doug has a long question comment. I'll try and start it here. We live on the edge of Botany Bog, north of Grand Rapids. Last summer, there was no outflow from the bog at all, a water flow, I would think. We actually put out large bowls of water in our backyard and found that wasps, hornets, and squirrels would drink from it. We had beaver in the bog. What do beaver, deer, and other large mammals do in times of drought, such as what occurred last summer?
The critters are very resilient, and beaver are a good example of a highly resilient animal. They will find the wet spots if they can. They do survive those. They just don't thrive in those conditions. So beaver, I think, would be probably most impacted by low water compared to like white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer, they'll find they can move. They tend to be very mobile and will certainly find a place to find water. the insects and such would be a good example. That's nice of you to put out a little water for some of those insects, because they certainly would enjoy it. You know, large mammals in times of drought, it's tough on moose. You know, they prefer a more moist environment. They certainly forage a lot in wetlands and that sort of thing. So yeah, they're going to have a tough time, especially if it's overly warm, because moose get thermally stressed pretty readily in the summer times here in Minnesota. We often don't think about that, but moose don't like it warm. They consider a balmy 78-degree day as too warm, and they often seek a refuge from that kind of excessive and oppressive heat.
Just a quick reminder, we are recording our Fridays with a Forester at umn.edu/Fridays. So if you do miss one of our Fridays with a Forester, you can actually look at the recordings at that link. Angie asks, you haven't mentioned problem animals, which is okay, but I'm just finishing a pretty good book, looks like at times, quite funny book. It's called Fuzz, When Nature Breaks the Law book by Mary Roach. And some wildlife are amazing, smart, and resilient.
Yeah, you know, it's always amazing to me to hear people report stories of various critters doing all sorts of things. You know, I laugh. I work a lot with master gardeners, and so I often hear, well, I've heard 1,000 tree squirrel stories, and indeed, a good example was an animal that is what we would maybe call smart. I don't really call them smart. I call them persistent, right? They live in a complex environment where problem solving is something that they need to be adapted to do, and they're persistent. You know, they're spending 24 hours a day trying to figure out how to find a cavity to nest in, or how to get into your bird feeder, frankly. And they don't have any trouble figuring it out because they're exceptionally persistent. So I always encourage folks to think, if they're having a problem animal, try to think like that animal and understand their ecology and their adaptations, and that will give you a much quicker leg up on trying to solve their problem or solve your problem. It's probably not a problem for them, right? They're usually, if they're a problem animal, they're exploiting something that you have that you'd rather not share.
Oh, Deb asked, could you put the link in the chat where we can find the recordings? I missed the 15 minutes. Thanks. Let's see. Matt or Emily, could you put that in our link or our chat, please? Oh, there it is. Thanks, Emily.
And it's right there on the screen, Gary. You've got it as z.umn.edu/Fridays.
Yes, thank you, John. And this is great. Any more questions for John? Wonderful. You know, John, I saw my first pileated woodpecker out my window on my second floor here at my office at home. It was just so amazing, and because I've never seen one before on my landscape, and I have a pretty small landscape, only 10 acres. And actually less of that, obviously, in grove and trees. But they're, I think it's nesting in my silver maple that has a chunk of it that's dead and dying, and making a nice hole and chips on the ground. And I'm thinking I mean, we may have a family here. We'll see. But kind of exciting. Love it.
Yeah, you must live on the prairies, Gary, because pileatids are not uncommon. But you're right; they are not abundant. You know, they have big home ranges, and boy, you want to start a fight, I think, in a group of foresters. You say something like pileated woodpeckers are the best thing in the world, because they can be damaging. They make those big holes. I've got some oak trees in my backyard, and so there's an insect that overwinters in somewhat funky oaks, right? That's as big as around as my finger, big and green, and quite tasty. And so the pileatids visit my yard on a regular basis and do some work on the trees. I've learned to live with it. I will say, like, from a problem animal standpoint, pileatids more damage. I think they are the most expensive wildlife interactor with telephone poles, right? They do more damage than anything else, and causing millions of dollars of damage annually. And a telephone pole is a terrible place to forage, so they're really just looking for good breeding habitat.
Troy asked a question, or maybe a comment. We have seen, these up north, Troy Salzer, we have seen or have been seeing more evidence of pine marten and deer in our area. What are suggested ways to encourage their habitat?
Well, generally they like they like a more complex environment that has lots of different kinds of, vegetative conditions, i.e., they are less happy in a recently harvested stand with even age stand, right? So you want something a little more complicated. Riparian areas would be a fantastic place. It kind of depends on what you have. If you have both Fisher and pine marten, the females den in cavities, in secure places that are usually associated with wood. So if you have lots of that, then you don't have to worry about creating it. If you don't have lots of it, you can actually create artificial boxes. And just like most of our human dominated landscapes or forestry dominated landscapes, we tend to remove old, decrepit snags and dead wood that's unproductive and that is, sometimes gets in the way of machinery and all that sort of thing. So we, over the last 100 years, have generally removed those cavity creating opportunities from the landscape. So usually with critters like pine marten and Fisher, they're a nesting box or nesting platform of some sort. Where they can have their babies is one of the limiting factors. Now, the trouble, of course, you have is that both of those critters have huge home ranges. So just because you put it out doesn't necessarily mean it'll get used, and it might not get used for a couple of years. So if you can look up online how to get a Fisher or a pine marten box and put it in the forest. Just because it doesn't get used doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It just means they haven't found it yet, or that maybe your neighbor has a bunch of snags and hollows and cavities and they can nest there. So that's one of the challenge with trying to encourage or foster habitat for these critters that have a home range of 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 acres. So that's what these creatures do, right? They roam. They're very active. Anything that you do to make sure that you have small mammals, rodents in your landscape, right? That's what they're eating. So things that distract that or discourage that would also discourage you seeing more Fisher or pine marten.
John's email is on the screen there, I believe. And if you want to email him directly on some questions, you certainly can. Any more questions for John?
And I'm jealous if you're seeing more pine marten and Fisher, by the way. That's always fun.
Looks like Jane asks, are bats in northern Minnesota surviving white nose?
Yeah. So Jane's referring to white nose syndrome. It's a fungal disease that is often transmitted among bat colonies that winter together in caves and that sort of thing. Cave roosting bats have, I think, declined by something on the order of 90 or 95% in Minnesota. So no, they're not surviving. They're taking it pretty hard. It is not universal. It affects different species in different ways. Species that migrate, that have been migratory, tend to be and then roosting not communally. So they tend to migrate south and roost individually. They have been harmed less, but those big colonies in northern Minnesota associated with some of the mining activities, those big colonies have had pretty substantial declines. And that's what's happened across the country. We're hopeful that there are some options. There are folks who are working on this problem, and that's about all I know at this point. But yeah, they're not doing. Let's see, is there much woodland owners can do to help bats? I just read Angie. So there are. Yeah, I'm looking. Do we end right at 10 there, Gary? I'm looking at 4 minutes.
Not necessarily. We can go a little further. That's fine. Bat houses are around, but do they work and so forth?
Yeah. So woodland. So bats in Minnesota, there are 7 or 8 species of bat in Minnesota. About half of them are cave nesters, but half of them are sort of solitary or tree nesters. They tend to roost, especially in the summertime, associated with trees, behind some loose bark, etc. So so trees in your landscape that are dead, standing snags, trees with loose bark, that sort of thing, right? Sometimes we're tempted to cut those things down because they're unproductive. Well, they're very productive from a bat standpoint for at least the species that nest associated with trees. So a little bit messier forestry practices would be helpful for bats. You know, I realize that that's not everybody's cup of tea, but that's certainly way better for bats if you can leave some of those messy things, the dead wood and loose bark, snags, and that sort of thing. You know, there are all sorts of you know, things like if you have a forest that has lots of those things, then bat houses and that sort of thing are probably a minor component, just because they have lots of great other habitats. Yeah, shagbark, hickory, and silver maple come to mind as loose barks. Yes, there are other species you could favor too, but even just having snags in the landscape, you know, any tree that has that when it starts to decay has that loose bark is a fantastic place for bats to, you know, they don't need much space. They just need to slip behind and have a crack, or maybe where you've got some wind damage. So you've got essentially a gap or a cavity, and by cavity, I mean, it just really can be just a crack that's maybe an inch wide that they can slip behind and have a great secure place to rear their young. They give birth there. The young often will stay there while mom goes and forages and comes back. So, you know, that's the sort of habitat that the bats will appreciate in the forested landscape.
Thank you, John. We do have an evaluation as you close the Zoom. It should pop up. Please fill it out and you stay anonymous, and it will help us with future webinars. Please put your suggestions on other topics of interest that you might want to hear through Fridays with a Forester. And then I've got one more slide here, and for more information, we have My Minnesota Woods and also the My Minnesota Woods email. If you don't receive the My Minnesota Woods monthly email, then you should, if you'd like, and you can email that address, and that website also has those sign up procedures. We have several Fridays with a Forester coming up till I think it going to May. So please stay with us, and yeah, any final questions from anyone? I want to thank John for joining us today. John, you've been a great wealth of information on wildlife, and people probably respond to your email and with more questions if they have some. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gary. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, if anybody has any questions or even a topic for a future Fridays with a Forester, I'd be happy to come on back and address that. So have a great day.
Thank you, John. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Fridays with a Forester.